The shot that killed Marcus, Henley missed her face by 3 inches, and Florence Cain knew her life as a respectable woman, ended the moment his blood splattered across her yellow dress. It was June 1878 in Winnetka, Kansas, a dusty railroad town where cattle drives met commerce and men settled disputes with whiskey or lead. Florence had been working at the mercantile for 2 years, saving every penny to buy a small piece of land where she could build something that belonged to her alone. At 23, she had learned to navigate a world that saw women as property or problems, neither of which she intended to be. Marcus Henley had other ideas. The cattle baron's son had been persistent in his attentions, growing more aggressive each time she refused. That afternoon, he cornered her in the back room of the store, his breath reeking of bourbon, his hands reaching for her with an entitlement that made her stomach turn. When he tried to force himself on her, Florence grabbed the nearest object, a cast iron skillet waiting to be shelved, and swung it with every ounce of strength and fury she possessed. She only meant to stop him, to make him leave her alone. But Marcus stumbled backward through the doorway, his hand going to his holster in drunken rage. The gun came up, wavering in his unsteady grip, and Florence knew he meant to shoot her. She dove sideways as the shot exploded in the small space, deafening and final. What Florence did not see was Mr. Patterson, the store owner, stepping around the corner at precisely the wrong moment. The bullet meant for her struck him in the throat. He collapsed without a sound, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been understanding before the light left them. Marcus stared at what he had done, his face draining of color. Then he looked at Florence, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, the decision forming. He was Marcus Henley, son of the richest man in 3 counties. She was nobody, a woman alone with no family to defend her name. "You killed him," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as the lie took shape. "You shot Patterson in cold blood." Florence scrambled to her feet, looking at the good man bleeding out on the floor, the man who had given her fair wages and treated her with respect. "That is not true. You know that is not true." But Marcus was already shouting, already calling for help, and when the townspeople came running, they saw what he wanted them to see. Florence standing over the body, Marcus the witness who would swear she had pulled the trigger. The sheriff, Roland Henley's man through and through, believed the cattle baron's son without question. Florence barely had time to grab her small savings from her rented room before she fled, knowing that justice in Winnetka wore a bought badge and answered to money, not truth. She ran north with nothing but the clothes on her back, $43 in her pocket, and a murder charge following her like a shadow. For 3 weeks, she moved from town to town, sleeping in hay lofts and abandoned buildings, working odd jobs for meals and keeping her face turned away from wanted posters that began appearing with her name and a $50 reward. The fear was constant, a living thing in her chest that made every stranger a potential threat, every lawman a harbinger of the gallows. She cut her long brown hair short with sewing scissors, stole men's clothing from a washing line, and tried to disappear into the vast expanse of Kansas prairie. That was how she ended up in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska, a small settlement barely worthy of the name town, where the Union Pacific had built a water stop and a handful of opportunists had built everything else. It was smaller than Winnetka, rougher, the kind of place where people minded their own business because everyone had something to hide. Florence found work at a boarding house, keeping her head down and her voice quiet, until the day a tall cowboy with sun-weathered skin and surprisingly gentle eyes sat down for breakfast and really looked at her. His name was Franklin Xavier, and he was 26 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested he had lived harder than his years. He worked for a ranch 15 miles north, came to town once a month for supplies and a hot meal that he did not have to cook over a campfire. There was something different about him, a stillness that suggested he listened more than he talked, observed more than he acted. Franklin noticed things, like how the new serving girl never met anyone's eyes directly, how she positioned herself near exits, how her hands shook slightly when the territorial marshal stopped in for coffee. He did not say anything that first day, or the second. But on his third visit to Cedar Ridge, he found Florence in the alley behind the boarding house, pressed against the wall, breathing hard, her face pale as milk. The marshal had come back, had looked at her a moment too long, and she was preparing to run again. "You are scared," Franklin said quietly, keeping his distance so she would not feel trapped. "And not of me." Florence looked at this cowboy with his worn leather vest and the Colt revolver sitting easy on his hip, and something in his face made her want to trust him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the way he stood there without judgment, without expectation, just offering a moment of human kindness in a world that had shown her precious little. "I am wanted by the law," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It felt like confession, like surrender, like the truth finally demanding to be spoken. Franklin was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes never leaving her face. Then he stepped closer and his voice was steady and sure, the first solid thing she had heard in weeks. "Then we will disappear together." Florence stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You do not even know me. You do not know what I am accused of. I know you jump when doors slam. I know you watch every stranger like they might be death walking. I know you have kind eyes and scared hands, and I know the difference between someone who has done evil and someone who has had evil done to them." He adjusted his hat, his jaw set with decision. "My horse is strong enough for two, and I know places where law does not reach. If you need to disappear, I can help you do it." "Why?" The question came out broken, disbelieving. "Why would you risk that for me?" Franklin looked away then, toward the horizon where the prairie met the sky in an endless line. "Because 5 years ago my sister needed help that never came. Men hurt her, and when she fought back, the law called her the criminal. She hanged for defending herself while her attackers drank whiskey at her funeral." His voice was rough with old pain. "I could not save her, but maybe I can save you." The words hit Florence like a physical blow, recognition and grief and something warmer flooding through her. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I am so sorry about your sister. So am I." He looked back at her. "My name is Franklin Xavier. I am nobody important, just a ranch hand who is good with horses and tired of watching injustice parade as law. If you want my help, it is yours. If you do not, I will walk away and forget we had this conversation." Florence made a decision in that moment that would alter the course of her life. "Florence Cain, and I did not kill anyone, but a man died because of me, and I do not think the truth matters anymore." "The truth always matters," Franklin said firmly. "Even when it does not change the outcome, it still matters." He glanced toward the street. "When does your shift end?" "An hour. I will be at the north edge of town with 2 horses and supplies. If you come, we ride. If you do not, I will know you chose different and I wish you well." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, his boots crunching on the hard, packed dirt, leaving Florence alone with the most important choice she had ever faced: trust a stranger or keep running alone. Risk believing someone or accept that isolation was her only safety. An hour later, Florence walked to the north edge of Cedar Ridge with her meager possessions wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Franklin was there, as promised, sitting on a sturdy roan gelding with a paint mare standing patient beside him. "I do not have money to pay you back," Florence said as she approached, "and I cannot promise this will not bring trouble down on your head." "I am not asking for money," Franklin replied, "and I have had trouble before. It is not as scary as people think." He offered her a canteen. "Drink. Then we ride hard until dark." Florence took the canteen, the water cool and clean in her dry throat, and then Franklin helped her onto the paint mare. His hands were calloused but careful, his touch brief and respectful. When she was settled, he gathered the reins and looked at her seriously. "If you want to tell me what happened, I will listen. If you do not, I will take you at your word that you are not a murderer. Either way, we head west into Colorado, where the mountains are big enough to hide entire towns, and the law is more concerned with claim jumpers than with fugitives from Kansas." "A man tried to hurt me," Florence said quietly, needing him to know, needing someone to believe her. "He was drunk and angry, and when I fought him off, he pulled his gun. The bullet hit someone else, an innocent man, a good man. But the one who pulled the trigger blamed me, and everyone believed him because his father owns half the county." Franklin's jaw tightened. "Men like that think they own everything, including people. I am glad you fought. I am sorry it cost you your life." "Not my life yet," Florence said, trying for bravery she did not quite feel. "Just everything I worked for. Then we will work for something new." Franklin nudged his horse forward. "Come on. We have miles to cover and a sunset to beat." They rode west through the afternoon, leaving Nebraska behind in a cloud of dust and desperate hope. Franklin set a steady pace, not pushing the horses too hard but covering ground quickly. He navigated by instinct and experience, avoiding main roads and settlements, keeping them in the wild spaces where people were scarce. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they reached a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. Franklin called for a halt, swinging down from his horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. "We will camp here tonight," he said, already unsaddling his roan. "There is good grass for the horses and water for us. We should be safe enough this far from any town." Florence dismounted less gracefully, her legs stiff from riding. She had grown up around horses but had not spent this many hours on one in years. Franklin noticed her awkward movements and offered a small smile. "You will be sore tomorrow," he said, "but it gets easier. Your body remembers how to adapt." They worked together in companionable silence, tending to the horses first as good riders did, making sure the animals were fed and watered and comfortable before seeing to their own needs. Franklin built a small fire, barely enough for warmth and too small to attract attention, and divided out hardtack and dried beef from his supplies. "It is not fancy," he said, handing her a portion. "It is more than I expected," Florence replied honestly. She sat on her bedroll, the food tasteless but necessary in her mouth, watching this cowboy who had upended his life for a stranger. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask anything." "The ranch you worked at, will they not wonder where you went? Will they not look for you?" Franklin poked at the fire with a stick. "I worked for them, but I was not bound to them. Ranch hands come and go, especially this time of year. They will find another cowboy easy enough." He glanced at her. "I left a note saying family matters called me away. It is not even a lie. You may not be blood, but helping someone in need feels like family to me." The words settled around Florence's heart, warm and unexpected. "You are a good man, Franklin Xavier. I try to be." He leaned back on his elbows. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with running or fear. Something from before, when you were just Florence living her life." She thought about it, reaching back to memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. "I wanted to own a bookshop," she said finally. "That was my dream. I love stories, always have." When I was a little girl, my mother taught me to read, which was not common for women in our situation. We were poor, and she cleaned houses for the wealthy families in our town. Sometimes they would give her old books instead of extra pay, and she would bring them home to me like treasure. Florence smiled at the memory. She died when I was 14, and I have been working ever since, but I always thought someday I would save enough to buy a little shop and fill it with books. That is a good dream, Franklin said gently. Better than most. Why a bookshop specifically? Because books are doors, Florence said simply. Doors to other lives, other places, other possibilities. I like the idea of being the keeper of doors, of helping people find the stories they needed. She laughed, a bitter sound. Foolish, probably. Not foolish, Franklin countered. Hopeful. There is a difference. He pulled his hat lower over his eyes. We should sleep. Morning comes early, and we have a long ride ahead. Florence lay down on her bedroll, staring up at the vast expanse of stars visible now that full dark had fallen. The prairie at night was alive with sounds, insects singing their eternal songs, the horses moving occasionally, the fire crackling low. Beside her, Franklin's breathing evened out into sleep, and she marveled at his ability to rest so easily with a wanted fugitive nearby. She did not sleep for a long time, her mind spinning with everything that had happened, everything that had changed. But when exhaustion finally claimed her, her last thought was that she felt safer lying on the hard ground with this stranger nearby than she had felt anywhere in weeks. Morning came with the smell of coffee somehow, and Florence opened her eyes to find Franklin already up, a small pot balanced over the rebuilt fire. He saw her wake and nodded a greeting. "Coffee," he said, as if this explained everything. "Trail coffee is terrible, but it wakes you up and gives you something warm. Figured you could use both." Florence sat up, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was indeed terrible, bitter and strong, but it was hot and generous, and she wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. "How long have you been awake?" "A while. I am an early riser." He sipped his own coffee. "We are about 2 days from the Colorado border if we push. After that, I am thinking we head to the mountains, find a mining town or a settlement where people are too busy surviving to ask questions." "And then what?" Florence asked. "We cannot run forever." "No," Franklin agreed. "But we can run long enough for memories to fade and attention to move elsewhere. Give it time and you become just another face in a territory full of faces. The West is big, Florence. Big enough to lose yourself in if you want to badly enough." They broke camp efficiently, covering signs of their presence, and rode out as the sun broke over the horizon. The second day was harder than the first, Florence's body protesting the extended hours on horseback, but she gritted her teeth and kept pace. Franklin was considerate, calling for breaks more frequently than he probably needed, making sure she had water and food. As they rode, they talked. Small things at first, safe topics. Franklin told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, learning to ride before he could properly walk, losing his parents to fever when he was 16. He talked about his sister, Sarah, who had been 2 years younger, with a laugh that could light up a room and a stubborn streak as wide as the Rio Grande. "She would have liked you," he said at one point. She always admired women who stood up for themselves, who did not just accept what men told them they were supposed to be. Florence shared her own stories, carefully edited but true in the ways that mattered. She talked about her mother's determination that Florence would have options beyond marriage or servitude, about learning arithmetic and reading and how to negotiate for fair wages. She talked about the satisfaction of honest work, of earning her way in the world, and how violated she had felt when Marcus Henley treated her like something he could simply take. "I should have left town the first time he bothered me," she said quietly. "But I had my job, my room. I was building something, and I did not want to start over again." "You should not have to run from men like that," Franklin said fiercely. "The fact that you do is wrong, not your fault." The vehemence in his voice startled her, and she looked at him more carefully. There was anger there, old and deep, the kind that came from watching injustice and being powerless to stop it. She understood that anger. She felt it herself, a coal of rage burning beneath her fear. On the afternoon of the third day, they crossed into Colorado. Franklin found them shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin, half collapsed, but still offering 4 walls and a roof. They were in the foothills now, the mountains rising ahead of them like a promise of sanctuary. Inside the cabin, out of the wind and away from prying eyes, they sat on the dirt floor and shared a meal of beans and hardtack. The silence between them had shifted, become something more comfortable, almost companionable. "Tomorrow we will reach Blackstone," Franklin said, then shook his head. "Sorry, the town is actually called Silverpeak. It is a mining settlement, grew up fast around a silver strike 3 years ago. The kind of place where people show up with nothing but ambition and nobody asks about your past because they are all running from something themselves." "Sounds perfect," Florence said dryly. "It is messy and rough, but there is work for anyone willing to do it. I figure we could find you a job, maybe at a boarding house or a restaurant. I can hire on with one of the mining operations, mucking ore or handling animals. We keep quiet, work hard, and in a few months we are just part of the scenery." "We," Florence repeated softly. "You keep saying we." Franklin met her eyes. "If that is all right. I am not assuming anything, Florence. If you want to part ways, I understand. But if you are willing, I would like to see this through, make sure you are settled safe before I move on." "And where will you move on to?" she asked, surprised by the twist of disappointment in her chest at the thought of him leaving. He shrugged. "Have not decided yet. Maybe nowhere. Maybe I will like Silverpeak and stay a while." His voice was casual, but something in his expression was not, something watchful and hoping. Florence looked at this man who had given up his job and his safety for her, who had ridden for days to bring her somewhere she might be safe, who spoke to her like she mattered. The realization crept up on her slowly, then all at once. She did not want him to leave. The thought of facing this new life alone, even in a safe place, felt suddenly unbearable. "I would like you to stay," she said quietly. "If that is what you want too. I know you have already done so much, and I have no right to ask for more, but I do not want to say goodbye to you yet." Something bright and genuine crossed Franklin's face, a smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines around his mouth. "I was hoping you would say that," he admitted. "Truth is, I have not felt this useful in a long time, and I like riding with you. You are brave and smart, and you do not complain even when I know you are hurting." "I am terrified," Florence confessed. "All the time. I just hide it." "Being brave does not mean not being scared," Franklin said. "It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway." "You have more courage than most men I have known." Florence Cain. That night they slept on opposite sides of the cabin, but Florence felt his presence like a warmth in the darkness, a reminder that she was not alone anymore. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping everyone at a distance, that this growing connection with Franklin felt both wonderful and frightening. Silverpeak was everything Franklin had promised: chaotic, rough, and wonderfully indifferent. The town clung to the mountainside like a barnacle, all wooden buildings and muddy streets, filled with miners and gamblers and working women and merchants all trying to grab their piece of the silver boom. They arrived in the morning, looking like exactly what they were, drifters down on their luck and looking for work. Nobody gave them a second glance. Franklin found them a room at a boarding house run by a formidable woman named Mrs. Garrett, who asked no questions and accepted their money without comment. The room was small, with one narrow bed and a washstand, and Florence stood in the doorway looking at that single bed with her heart pounding. "I will sleep on the floor," Franklin said immediately, reading her hesitation. "Or I can find another room if that is better." "No," Florence said quickly. "I mean, the floor is fine, I just—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain that it was not fear of him that made her pulse race, but something else entirely, something that felt dangerous in a completely different way. They established a routine quickly. Franklin hired on with a mining company, working as a teamster, hauling ore from the mountain to the processing mills. It was hard physical labor, but it paid decent wages and kept him outdoors, which he preferred. Florence found work at the Silverpeak restaurant, cooking and serving meals to miners who were too tired or too lonely to care who brought them their food. Days turned into weeks. They lived in careful proximity, sharing space but maintaining respectful distance, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. Franklin woke before dawn and came home after dark, his body exhausted but his spirit steady. Florence worked long shifts serving stew and coffee and listening to the gossip and stories that flowed through the restaurant like a river. Nobody in Silverpeak cared about their past. The town was too busy hurtling toward its own uncertain future to worry about where people came from. Florence began to relax, the constant tension that had lived in her shoulders slowly easing. She also began to notice things about Franklin. Small things that should not have mattered but somehow did. The way he always brought her coffee in the morning before heading to work, remembering exactly how she liked it. The way he mended his own clothes in the evening with surprising skill, his large hands careful with needle and thread. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, his full attention on her like she was the most important thing in his world at that moment. And she noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching, his eyes soft with something that made her breath catch. It was 2 months after their arrival in Silverpeak when everything shifted. Florence finished her shift at the restaurant and walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon sunshine, her body tired but her mood light. She had saved almost $30 from her wages, money that belonged to her alone, and the simple fact of that financial independence made her feel powerful. She climbed the stairs to their room and opened the door to find Franklin sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his face buried in his hands. For a moment, she thought he was hurt, and panic seized her throat. "Franklin, what happened? Are you injured?" He looked up quickly and she saw tears on his face, raw grief that he had been trying to hide. "I am sorry," he said roughly. "I did not expect you back yet." Florence closed the door and sat down beside him, her earlier fatigue forgotten. "What is wrong? Please tell me." Franklin wiped at his face with his sleeve, embarrassed. "It is the anniversary," he said quietly. "Sarah died 4 years ago today. I try not to think about it, try to keep moving forward, but sometimes it just hits me, you know. The fact that she is gone, that I could not save her, that men got away with what they did to her." Without thinking, Florence reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. His hand was rough and warm, and he gripped hers like a lifeline. "Tell me about her," Florence said softly. "Not about how she died. Tell me about who she was, what made her laugh, what she loved." So Franklin talked. He told her about Sarah's obsession with horses, how she could gentle the wildest colt with patience and soft words. He told her about her terrible singing voice and how she sang anyway, loud and off-key and joyful. He told her about the time she punched a boy who was bullying a smaller child, and how their father had tried to be stern but could not quite hide his pride. As he talked, Florence rested her head on his shoulder, offering comfort through proximity and presence. And Franklin leaned into her, accepting what she offered, his voice eventually steadying as the memories became more sweet than painful. When he finally fell silent, they sat together in the gathering dusk, hands still entwined. Something fundamental shifted between them. "Thank you," Franklin said quietly, "for listening, for being here." "Thank you for letting me in," Florence replied. "For trusting me with something that matters." Franklin turned his head, and suddenly his face was very close to hers, his breath warm on her cheek. "Florence," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, weighted with meaning. "I need to tell you something." Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What?" "I am falling in love with you," he said simply, honestly. "I did not mean to. I know the timing is terrible and we are both trying to survive, and I have no right to burden you with this. But I have never been good at lying, and I need you to know. You do not have to feel the same way. You do not have to do anything about it. But I cannot keep pretending I see you as just a friend when every time you smile at me, my whole world gets brighter." Florence stared at him, at this good, brave, gentle man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, who worked himself to exhaustion and still brought her coffee every morning, who cried for his sister and loved with his whole heart. And she realized she had been falling too slowly and surely since the moment he stood in that alley and offered her hope. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And it terrifies me because I have lost so much already, and I do not know if I can bear to lose this, to lose you." "You will not lose me," Franklin said fiercely. "Florence, I am not going anywhere, not unless you tell me to go." She kissed him then, closing the small distance between them, her hand coming up to cup his face. His stubble was rough beneath her palm, and his lips were soft and sure against hers, and for the first time in months, Florence felt something other than fear and exhaustion. She felt wanted, cherished, possible. Franklin kissed her back with a gentleness that made her ache, his hand cradling the back of her head, his touch reverent. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said again, like the words needed to be spoken as many times as he could say them. "Whatever comes next, whatever we have to face, I love you." "I love you," Florence replied, testing the words, finding them true and solid and real. "Franklin Xavier, I love you." They held each other as darkness fell completely, the room lit only by the moon coming through the window. Eventually, they moved to the bed, lying together fully clothed, wrapped in each other's arms, talking in whispers about everything and nothing. Franklin told her about his dreams of owning land someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses. Florence confessed that she still wanted her bookshop, that the dream had not died even when everything else fell apart. "We could do it," Franklin said quietly. "Save our money, be smart about it. In a few years, we could have enough to buy something small, somewhere quiet, a ranch with a house big enough for a bookshop in the front room." "That sounds impossible," Florence said, but she was smiling. "So did escaping, and we did that," Franklin pointed out. "So did falling in love, and here we are." They fell asleep like that, wound around each other, and when Mrs. Garrett knocked the next morning to collect rent, she found them still fully clothed and dead to the world, and she smiled to herself and closed the door quietly. Life in Silverpeak continued, but everything was different now. Franklin and Florence were a couple openly affectionate in the way of people who had found each other against all odds. They held hands when they walked through town. They met for lunch when their schedules allowed. They built a life together in the margins of their days, small and careful and precious. The work was hard, and money was always tight, but they saved every penny they could spare, depositing their wages with the bank in town and watching the total slowly grow. $5 one week, 3 the next. Sometimes nothing when expenses ate everything, but always moving forward. It was 6 months after they arrived in Silverpeak when trouble found them anyway. Florence was serving lunch when a man walked into the restaurant, well-dressed and official-looking, with a territorial marshal's badge on his vest. Her blood went cold, her hands shaking as she poured coffee for a miner who did not notice her distress. The marshal sat down at the counter, and Florence had no choice but to approach him, her face carefully neutral even as panic screamed through her veins. "What can I get for you?" she asked, proud that her voice stayed steady. The marshal looked at her, really looked, and Florence saw the moment of recognition in his eyes. "Coffee and whatever the special is," he said slowly. "And maybe you could tell the owner I would like a word when he has a moment." Florence nodded and fled to the kitchen, her heart hammering. The owner, Mr. Perkins, was a decent man who minded his own business. But if the law came asking questions, he would not lie for her. She thought about running, about walking out the back door and disappearing before the marshal could stop her. But where would she go? And how could she leave without warning Franklin in the end? She brought the marshal his food and coffee and waited for the axe to fall. But the marshal just ate his meal, paid, and left without another word. Florence watched him go, confused and terrified, and finished her shift in a daze. When she got back to the boarding house, Franklin was already there, pacing the small room like a caged animal. He pulled her into his arms the moment she walked through the door. "I heard a territorial marshal was in town," he said into her hair. "I was terrified he had taken you." "He saw me," Florence said, her voice muffled against his chest. "He looked right at me and I think he recognized me, but he just ate his lunch and left. I do not understand." Franklin pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. "Did he say anything, make any threats?" "No, nothing. He asked to speak to the owner, but as far as I know, he never did." Florence looked up at Franklin. "What does it mean?" "I do not know," Franklin admitted. "But we should be ready to leave if we need to. Pack our things tonight, have the horses prepared. If he comes back with men, we run." They spent the evening in tense preparation, gathering their belongings, counting their money, planning escape routes. But the marshal did not return that night, or the next day, or the day after that. A week later, Florence was sweeping the restaurant after closing when the marshal walked in again. This time, there was no mistaking his purpose. He locked the door behind him and turned to face her. "Florence Cain," he said, not a question. Florence gripped the broom handle like a weapon. "If you have come to arrest me, I will not go quietly." "I did not come to arrest you." The marshal held up his hands, showing they were empty. "My name is Robert Tierney. I am a territorial marshal, yes, but I am also someone who believes in investigating before I condemn." "I have been looking into your case." Florence stared at him. "What?" "The murder of Patterson in Winnetka, Kansas. The wanted notice on you." Marshal Tierney pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "Something about it did not sit right with me. $50 for murder is low." The description was vague, and when I asked around in Winnetka, I found witnesses who told me Marcus Henley has a reputation for violence toward women, and that his father has been buying silence for years. Hope and disbelief warred in Florence's chest. "Then you know I did not kill anyone." "I know Marcus Henley killed Patterson, either intentionally or by accident, and blamed you because you were convenient," Marshal Tierney said bluntly. "I know Roland Henley paid the sheriff to issue that warrant without a proper investigation. I know you are innocent." Florence's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the floor, the broom clattering away. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am tired of rich men getting away with murder while innocent people hang for crimes they did not commit." The marshal's voice was hard. "I cannot arrest Marcus Henley." He fled to Mexico after you ran, and extradition is a nightmare. But I can clear your name. I have sworn statements from 3 people who saw him pull his gun that day, who heard him threaten you previously. I have documentation of his father's payments to the sheriff. It is enough to have the warrant withdrawn. You would do that, Florence whispered. Why? Because it is the right thing to do, Marshal Tierney said simply. And because I am sick of men like the Henleys. If I can stop even one person from hanging for their crimes, maybe that means something. Florence pressed her hands to her face, tears streaming through her fingers. I do not know what to say. I do not know how to thank you. No thanks necessary. Just live your life, Miss Cain. That is thanks enough. The marshal stood. It will take a few weeks to finalize everything, file the paperwork, get the warrant officially dismissed. But you are a free woman. You can go home if you want, back to Kansas. I do not want to go back, Florence said immediately. There is nothing for me in Kansas. My home is here now. Marshal Tierney smiled. Then I wish you well in Silverpeak. If anyone comes looking for you, send them to me. I will set them straight. When Franklin came home that night, Florence was sitting on their bed, staring at nothing, her face blotchy from crying. He dropped to his knees in front of her immediately, his hands on her face, searching for injury. What happened? Are you hurt? Did someone hurt you? I am free, Florence said wonderingly. Franklin, the marshal, came back and he investigated and he believes me. He is going to clear my name. I am not wanted anymore. Franklin went very still. Say that again. I am free. Florence started crying again, overwhelmed by relief and joy and disbelief. I do not have to run anymore. I do not have to hide. I can just live. Franklin pulled her into his arms and she felt wetness on his face too, his own tears mixing with hers. You are free, he repeated like a prayer. Oh, Florence, you are free. They held each other and cried together, releasing months of fear and tension and uncertainty. When they finally calmed, Franklin cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, deep and sweet and full of promise. I want to marry you, he said when they broke apart. Not because you need protection or because we are pretending to be something we are not, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you, a real life, out in the open with no secrets and no running. Florence Cain, will you marry me? Yes, Florence said through her tears, laughing now. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I want to marry you, Franklin Xavier. I want everything with you. They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Silverpeak, with Mrs. Garrett and Mr. Perkins as witnesses. Florence wore a new dress, pale blue instead of the blood-stained yellow she had fled in, and Franklin wore his best shirt and a look of such pure happiness that it made her heart ache. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Franklin kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Florence felt the last pieces of her old life fall away, replaced by something new and bright and chosen. They celebrated with dinner at the restaurant, where Mr. Perkins insisted on giving them the meal for free, and the miners and working women of Silverpeak raised glasses to toast the happy couple. In a town of strangers and drifters, they had somehow found community. That night, in their small room that was now truly theirs, Florence and Franklin came together as husband and wife. There was nervousness and fumbling, the awkwardness of new intimacy, but there was also tenderness and laughter and joy. Franklin was gentle and patient, making sure Florence felt safe and cherished, and when they finally joined together, it felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay tangled in the narrow bed, skin to skin, hearts beating in sync. I love you, Mrs. Xavier, Franklin murmured into her hair. I love you, Mr. Xavier, Florence replied, testing out her new name, finding it fit perfectly. Life settled into a new rhythm after their marriage. They continued working and saving, their shared goal of land and a bookshop feeling more possible with each passing month. Florence wrote to Marshal Tierney, who confirmed that the warrant had been officially withdrawn and that she was free to travel anywhere without fear of arrest. The relief was enormous, but Florence found she had no desire to leave Silverpeak. The town had given her sanctuary when she needed it most, and more importantly, it was where she had found Franklin, where they had built their life together. It was 9 months after their wedding when Florence realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and her body felt different, strange, and new. When she told Franklin, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Florence asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Franklin said, dropping to his knees and pressing his face to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your mama and I cannot wait to meet you." Pregnancy was harder than Florence expected. She was sick constantly for the first few months, could barely keep food down, and had to cut back her hours at the restaurant. But Franklin was endlessly patient, bringing her ginger tea and holding her hair back when she was ill, never complaining about the extra burden. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. They talked endlessly about names and wondered whether they would have a son or a daughter. Franklin built a small cradle in his spare time, his hands careful with the wood, making something beautiful and sturdy for their child. Florence went into labor on a cold March evening in 1879, nearly a year after they had arrived in Silverpeak. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Mrs. Garrett and the town's midwife, with Franklin pacing the hallway outside their room, forbidden from entering but refusing to leave. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with strong lungs and his father's blue eyes, Franklin burst into the room at the first cry and fell to his knees beside the bed. "A son," Florence said weakly, exhausted but radiant. "We have a son, Franklin." Franklin touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his face full of wonder. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him William James Xavier, after Franklin's father and Florence's mother, and he became the center of their world. Franklin was a devoted father, taking William everywhere when he was not working, talking to him constantly even though the baby could not possibly understand. Florence watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him, if that was possible. Money was tighter with a baby, but they made it work. The people of Silverpeak rallied around them, donating clothes and supplies, checking in to make sure Florence and the baby were healthy. It turned out that a town full of outcasts and drifters made excellent family when blood kin was not around. William thrived, growing from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and laughed at his father's silly faces. And as he grew, Franklin and Florence continued saving, their dream still alive even as their family expanded. It took 3 years, but they finally had enough money to buy land. Not much, just 20 acres on the outskirts of Silverpeak, but it was theirs, paid for with honest work and determination. Franklin built them a house, small but solid, with a large front room that Florence immediately claimed for her future bookshop. They moved out of the boarding house on William's 2nd birthday, carrying their few possessions to their own home on their own land, and Florence cried happy tears as she crossed the threshold for the first time. "We did it," she said, looking around at the empty rooms full of possibility. "We actually did it." "You did it," Franklin corrected, pulling her close. "You survived and you fought and you built this with me. I am so proud of you, Florence." The bookshop opened 6 months later. Florence had been buying books whenever they could afford them, building a collection slowly and carefully. When she finally opened the doors, she had 3 shelves stocked with everything from dime novels to Shakespeare, and a sign outside that read Cain's Books in careful lettering. Business was slow at first. Silverpeak was not exactly a literary town, but Florence was patient, and gradually people began to come. Miners looking for entertainment on their days off, mothers wanting to teach their children to read, the town's school teacher seeking supplies for her classroom. Florence loved every moment of it. She loved helping people find stories, loved seeing their faces light up when a book caught their interest, loved being the keeper of doors the way she had always dreamed. Franklin continued working with the mining company, but his real passion was the horses. He started breeding a few on their land, carefully selecting animals for temperament and strength. Word spread that Franklin Xavier could train a horse better than anyone, and slowly he built a side business that brought in extra income. Life was good. Hard, but good. They worked long hours and counted every penny, but they were building something that mattered, raising their son, loving each other more with each passing year. When William was 4, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. Their daughter arrived in the fall of 1883, a tiny girl with Florence's brown hair and a determined cry that suggested she would not be pushed around. They named her Sarah, after Franklin's sister, and when Franklin held his daughter for the first time, he wept openly, finally at peace with the grief he had carried for so long. "She would have loved you," Florence said softly, watching her husband cradle their daughter. "Your sister. She would have loved seeing you this happy." "I think she is watching," Franklin said, looking down at tiny Sarah's face. "I think she sent you to me, Florence. I think she knew I needed saving as much as you did." William adored his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and the small house rang with the sounds of children and laughter and life being lived fully. The years passed in a blur of work and family and small joys. The bookshop slowly expanded, filling all the shelves Florence built, requiring more inventory. Franklin's horse business grew until it rivaled his mining income, and eventually he quit the mines entirely to focus on breeding and training full-time. They added onto the house, giving the children proper bedrooms and expanding the bookshop space. They built a barn for the horses and corrals for training. They planted a garden and fruit trees and slowly transformed their 20 acres into a thriving homestead. William grew into a serious boy who loved books like his mother and horses like his father, finding joy in both worlds. Sarah was wilder, constantly in motion, climbing trees and chasing chickens and driving her parents to distraction with her fearlessness. Florence and Franklin fell more in love with each passing year, their partnership deepening into something unshakable. They still held hands when they walked together. They still kissed goodnight every evening. They still talked for hours after the children were asleep, sharing dreams and plans and memories. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Franklin surprised Florence with a gift. He led her to the barn, where a sign waited, freshly painted and beautiful. "Xavier Ranch and Books," it read. "Established 1879. Technically, we got married in 78, Florence pointed out, but she was crying again, these happy tears that seemed to come so easily now. "But we bought the land in 79, Franklin said. "The year we truly started building our life together. The year we stopped running and started living." Florence kissed him there in the barn, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had created, the love they had fought so hard to keep. "I love you, Franklin Xavier," she said. "Thank you for finding me in that alley. Thank you for offering to disappear with me. Thank you for every single day since." "Thank you for trusting me," Franklin replied. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy who had nothing but good intentions and a fast horse. Thank you for building this life with me." They stood together in the fading light, and Florence thought about the girl she had been, running for her life, terrified and alone. That girl could never have imagined this future, this happiness, this sense of home that had nothing to do with walls and everything to do with the man standing beside her. When William turned 16, he took over much of the horse training, showing his father's gift with animals. Sarah, at 12, split her time between helping her mother in the bookshop and riding the ranch land like she was born to the saddle. They were good kids, growing into good people, and Franklin and Florence watched them with pride and gratitude. The bookshop had become a gathering place for Silverpeak, hosting reading groups and serving as an informal library for anyone who could not afford to buy books. Florence loved her role as the town's bookseller, loved the connections she made, the lives she touched with stories. Franklin's horses were known throughout Colorado now, sought after for their intelligence and sure-footedness in mountain terrain. He had become something of an expert, his opinion valued, his training methods studied and copied. They were not rich, would never be rich, but they were comfortable and content, and that was worth more than gold. It was 1891, 13 years after that desperate flight from Kansas, when Marshal Tierney appeared at their ranch unexpectedly. He was older now, silver in his hair, but still carrying himself with authority. Florence answered the door, her heart giving an old, instinctive jump of fear before she remembered she was safe. She was free, she was home. "Marshal Tierney," she said, surprised. "This is unexpected. Mrs. Xavier," he replied, tipping his hat. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was passing through Silverpeak and wanted to see how you were faring." "Come in, please," Florence said, stepping aside. "Franklin will want to see you too." They gathered in the bookshop, surrounded by shelves filled with stories, and Florence served coffee while Marshal Tierney looked around with approval. "You have done well," he said simply. "Better than well, you have thrived." "We have been blessed," Florence agreed. "And we have never forgotten that we owe much of that to you. Without your investigation, your willingness to pursue the truth, I would still be running or dead." "You owe me nothing," Marshal Tierney said firmly. "But I did want to tell you something. Marcus Henley is dead. He was killed in Mexico 6 months ago in a bar fight. His father followed him to the grave last month, heart failure. The whole Henley empire has crumbled, the ranch sold to pay debts. Justice took its time, but it came eventually." Franklin reached over and took Florence's hand, and she squeezed his fingers gratefully. "I wish I could say I am sorry they are gone," she said slowly. "But I am not. They hurt people and never paid the price. I am glad they can never hurt anyone else." "A fair response," the marshal said. He stood to leave, shaking Franklin's hand. "You take care of her, Xavier. And you, Mrs. Xavier, keep fighting the good fight. The world needs more people like you, people who survive and build and refuse to let the bastards win." After he left, Florence and Franklin sat together in the bookshop processing the news. The ghosts of their past were finally, truly laid to rest. "You ever think about how different our lives could have been?" Florence asked quietly. "If you had not been in that alley? If you had not offered to help?" "Every day," Franklin admitted. "And every day I am grateful that I was exactly where I needed to be to find you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence. You and William and Sarah and this life we have built. I would not change a single moment, not even the hard parts, because they brought us here." "I love you," Florence said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I will love you until my last breath." "And I will love you beyond that," Franklin replied, kissing her forehead, "into whatever comes next and forever after that." The years continued their steady march. William married at 20, bringing home a sweet woman named Clara who loved books as much as his mother. Sarah, true to form, took longer to settle, working for several years as a ranch hand on various spreads before finally falling in love with a quiet cowboy named Daniel when she was 22. Franklin and Florence became grandparents, their house filling with the next generation. William and Clara had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Sarah and Daniel added 2 more boys to the family chaos. The ranch expanded to accommodate everyone, buildings added, businesses thriving, family growing. Florence's hair turned gray, then white, but her smile remained bright and her love of stories never dimmed. Franklin's hands became gnarled with arthritis, but they were still gentle with horses and tender with his wife. They grew old together, watching their children build their own lives, their grandchildren grow and thrive. The bookshop passed to Sarah's daughter, who had inherited Florence's love of reading. The horse business went to William's oldest son, who had Franklin's gift with animals. On a spring evening in 1912, 34 years after that fateful meeting in Cedar Ridge, Franklin and Florence sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. They were both 75 now, their bodies worn but their spirits undiminished. "Do you remember the night we met?" Florence asked, her hand in Franklin's as it had been for over 3 decades. "I remember thinking you looked like you were drowning," Franklin said softly. "Like you were going under and desperately needed someone to throw you a rope." "You did more than throw me a rope," Florence said. "You jumped in the water with me. You risked everything for a stranger." "You were never a stranger," Franklin replied. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew you were going to be important. I did not know how, did not know we would end up here, but I knew I could not walk away from you." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture as familiar as breathing. "I have been so happy, Franklin, happier than I ever thought possible. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," Franklin corrected gently. "We saved each other, Florence. That is what love does." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Around them, their family moved through the ranch, continuing the work of the day, building on the foundation Florence and Franklin had laid so many years ago. "No regrets?" Florence asked softly. "Not a single one," Franklin said firmly. "You?" "Only that we do not have more time," Florence admitted. "I would live this life with you 1,000 times over and still want more." "Then we will have to make the most of whatever time we have left," Franklin said, kissing the top of her head, "and hope that wherever we go next, we go together." "Together," Florence agreed. "Always together." They lived for several more years, watched more grandchildren be born, celebrated their 55th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family. When Florence's heart finally gave out in her sleep at the age of 82, Franklin followed her within a month, as if he could not bear to be apart from her, even in death. They were buried side by side on their ranch, under a cottonwood tree they had planted the year they bought the land. Their headstone was simple, bearing only their names, their dates, and a single line. They disappeared together and found everything. The ranch continued for generations. The bookshop remained open, and the story of Franklin and Florence Xavier became family legend. The tale of a wanted woman and a cowboy who chose love over safety, who built a life in the mountains of Colorado, who proved that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, the ones we fight for, the ones we refuse to let go. Their great-great-grandchildren still ride horses bred from Franklin's original stock. They still read books from Florence's carefully curated collection. And they still tell the story of how it all began, with a desperate woman in an alley, a cowboy with a good heart and the simple promise that changed everything. Then we will disappear together. And they did. Not into obscurity, not into hiding, but into a life so full of love and meaning that the world they left behind ceased to matter. They disappeared from their old lives and found new ones, better ones together. It was the greatest vanishing act of all, not because they could not be found, but because they found each other, and that was all they ever needed.